All right, without further ado, I'd love to bring up our next speakers. We have Ortomas Saenz, President and General Counsel at MALDEF. So in 2009, Tomas Saenz returned to MALDEF, Mexican American Legal Defense and Educational Fund, as President and General Counsel. He leads MALDEF's national efforts to promote the civil rights of all Latinos y Latinas living in the United States. He previously practiced civil rights litigation at MALDEF for 12 years, including 4 years as Vice President of Litigation. He was MALDEF's lead counsel in the successful challenge to California's anti-immigrant Proposition 187, and he led numerous civil rights cases in the areas of immigrants' rights, education, employment, and voting rights. He's achieved several victories against ordinances unlawfully restricting the rights of day laborers, served as lead counsel in the 2001 challenge to California's congressional redistricting, and initiated the employment discrimination lawsuit, resulting in a $50 million settlement with Abercrombie and Fitch. Great. All right. So he will be in conversation today with Hunter representing Power to Fly. I'm going to pass the mic to both of you all. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you so much for that wonderful intro. And thank you, Thomas Saenz, for being here today. How are you?
Happy to be here. Thanks, Hunter.
Thanks. So thanks for taking time in your day. It looks like you're at the office, huh? Where are you based?
I'm at the office. We are headquartered in Los Angeles.
Oh, you're in LA, right? We were talking a little bit before this that we're both from there. Can you tell me a little bit about, about yourself and some insights on your career journey?
So I have spent most of my career here at MALDEF, first as a staff attorney, regional counsel, vice president of litigation, and I left briefly to go work as counsel to Mayor Antonio Villaraigosa of Los Angeles, the first Latino mayor of Los Angeles in over 130 years, I believe. And I came back to MALDEF as president and general counsel in 2009. So I've had the great honor of leading this organization that is now 53 years old for the last dozen years, and always very inspired by our clients, very inspired by our staff, and very inspired by the courage and resilience that I see in the Latino community that we represent every day. I became a civil rights lawyer as my goal on attending law school, and I'm happy to have achieved that dream through my work at MALDEF.
Wow, wonderful. So can you tell me a little bit more about what MALDEF does and your mission with MALDEF?
So our mission is to promote the civil rights of all Latinos living in the United States, and we work in 5 program areas. One of them is new, so it didn't get included in the introduction, but those areas are education, employment, immigrant rights, voting rights, and a new program designed to counter open and obvious racism. And that's occasioned by the unfortunate real decline in how white supremacy, white nationalism are received in this country, including their unfortunate promotion by our recent former president, Donald Trump. So we do our work in a number of different ways, but we're known most for the work we do in court. We represent plaintiffs in challenging various practices in those areas, but we also engage in advocacy in Congress and in important state legislatures around the country. We engage in community education efforts so that our community is aware of important issues like the census, like redistricting, like particular policy issues when they flare up in our political situation. And we engage in important communications and media work. So we use 4 different approaches to try to promote the civil rights of all Latinos. We were founded 53 years ago, very much consciously modeled on the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, which had about a decade and a half before our founding, the monumental victory in Brown versus Board of Education. And we were very much modeled on them with a desire by our founders to create a legal arm to promote the civil rights of Latinos. And our lead founder was a lawyer in South Texas by the name of Pete Tijerina. And he sought to create what became MALDEF because of his own experience in witnessing blatant discrimination in the legal system in Texas in the 1960s.
And you mentioned that you work in, there's one of the branches, news and media, that you also touch on that wasn't really mentioned in the bio. Can you expand on that a little bit more?
Sure, we understand and have come to really attempt to use media to get the word out about our work because we have limited capacity. So if, for example, we bring an employment discrimination case, we want to publicize it. We want the people to know about it, not just folks who might be victims of similar discrimination, but also other companies to understand where they may be engaging in similar conduct and need to stop that conduct. So media communications can be important deterrents, both by giving people information about their own rights, but also effectively sending a warning to those who may similarly be discriminating in their conduct, whether that's government or private business, you name it. We want to use communications and media to ensure that we're having bigger impact than we might just with a single case.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned, there's examples all around. I think we notice about open and obvious racism, you use the phrase, but it also can be insidious and more subtle. Can you talk about those ways that it shows up that for people that you represent that maybe, I might not think about if I just saw it on the news or I see an employer do something that's blatantly racist, okay, I'm going to say something, but for something that maybe shows up for the people you represent that I might not be aware of?
Well, I think you probably are aware of it, and that is really the experience of the Latino community with civil rights in the United States, which is we often have had to fit patterns of what appear to be obvious discrimination into legal rules that weren't necessarily designed for our community and for the purposes of preventing the conduct we see. And that is the Latino community experiences lots of discrimination that is ostensibly on the basis of something else, another attribute, whether that's language, accent, immigration status. But there are many different ways of hiding what is fairly clear as race discrimination, but is couched in other terms. And often we have to meet that challenge. I'll give you an example, perhaps less obvious, from what we're doing right now, which is every 10 years at MALDEF, we engage in lots of work around the redistricting process, which is a process by which electoral districts are redrawn after every census, constitutionally required to ensure that our electoral districts are relatively equal in population. So not just congressional districts, but state legislative districts and often local districts, city council, school, community college, and the like. But what we often see is here, race discrimination targeting the very quickly growing Latino community is couched in terms of politics. So we're not discriminating against you because you're Latino. We're discriminating against this community because it tends to vote Democratic or because it does not support the current incumbent elected officials. With a growing community like the Latino community, we'll point out, of course, as we all read that over the course of the last decade, according to the Census Bureau, 51% of the total growth of the United States was in the Latino community. So a rapidly growing population that's reaching real critical mass that then enables us to elect candidates of choice, but only if we have districts that are drawn fairly. If districts are drawn unfairly, discriminatorily, then that can prevent even a growing large group like Latinos from electing candidates of their choice and instead being consistently outvoted by other communities. So often discrimination comes in different veneers, but our mission is to break through those veneers and make sure that the Latino community is able to thrive free of the challenges still presented on a daily basis of discrimination.
Yeah, absolutely. And so you were talking, you mentioned quite a bit there about voting, right? So can you tell me a bit about how MALDEF works to propagate awareness about legal rights and voting rights for immigrants?
So Our voting work is really designed to ensure that every person who has the right to vote, including, importantly, naturalized immigrants, including the huge numbers of Latinos who are turning 18 every day in this country, that they all have the ability to easily participate in exercising their right to vote. Now, that can mean a number of different things. As you know, we are seeing more and more headlines of attempts to prevent people from casting a vote. And that may be by coming up with very restrictive voter ID provisions, saying you have to be able to show one of a limited number of identification cards in order to vote. It may be what we've seen a lot, making it harder for newly eligible voters to register, facing obstacles like proving their citizenship that were not faced by voters who registered in the past. But it also takes the form of more subtle discrimination on voting rights. And that's the redistricting that I mentioned. That's not preventing folks from voting, but if you draw districts in a strategic way to preserve the power of those who are already elected, you can prevent a sizable and growing minority group like Latinos from actually having a meaningful vote. You do that by drawing district lines that prevent them from electing a candidate of choice that ensure that they will be outvoted every time. And that has just as serious an effect on the voting process, because so many people give up on voting when their candidates get defeated time after time after time. And if you have unfair discriminatory lines, that's what happens. Your candidates get defeated time after time after time. So we challenge both the direct prevention from voting, as well as the subtle deterrence from voting through things like redistricting.
And you mentioned, with all these, with voting and all, I love that you brought up also young people, right? So becoming eligible to vote, and people that that you have worked with through, at MALDEF has focuses on education and unemployment. Can you talk a little bit about those domains? And also, I know you guys do some scholarships, right?
So in education, we've had to do lots of work about education access, just getting in the door. One of our most famous cases is a 1982 decision out of the US Supreme Court in a case called Plyler versus Doe. And that was a case where the state of Texas told school districts that they could bar or charge tuition to undocumented immigrant students. Now, obviously, charging tuition is the same as barring the door to a schoolhouse. But in Plyler versus Doe, a case brought by MALDEF, the Supreme Court decided that every child, regardless of immigration status, has the right to attend free public school from kindergarten through 12th grade. So it's things as basic as access to the school, but equally important is equity. Equity of resources, equity of outcomes, trying to ensure that equal educational opportunity is realized for all students. Often that's prevented by providing less resources to schools that have large populations of Latino students, or by engaging in tracking of students away, for Latinos away from college-going coursework to coursework that will prevent them from going on to college. So it's both access and equity, and we do work in the higher education arena as well. Now in employment, we've long been engaged in challenging discrimination against Latinos. You heard in my introduction that one of our biggest cases in the last 20 years was against Abercrombie and Fitch, which had a pattern of not employing people of color as their salespeople. And where they did hire people of color, they would put them in the back in the stock room and not allow them to be out front. We, together with others, challenged that. And that's a case that came to us through a young Latino man who was employed by Abercrombie and Fitch, but was eventually zeroed out, had his hours cut down to zero. So discrimination like that, but also discrimination, for example, against recipients of DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, which is an initiative created by the Obama administration to provide protection to young immigrants who came to the United States in an undocumented status before the age of 16. And it provided work authorization along with that protection. And work authorization means you have the right to work. But we've seen too many companies, including some of the biggest, most sophisticated companies in the world, that have prevented DACA recipients from being hired. Sometimes that's from ignorance of the law, Sometimes that's from not understanding what DACA is. And sometimes it was a subtle way of discriminating against DACA recipients, the majority of whom are Latino. But we brought many cases recently challenging discrimination against work authorized DACA recipients, again, by some of the biggest companies in the world. And another important aspect of our employment work is challenging working conditions in industries that are overwhelmingly Latino in composition. And that could be the agricultural work, service work, but wherever there's a large Latino workforce that is facing violations of occupational safety and health or wage and hour, those are also areas of great concern to us. And finally, Hunter, you asked about scholarships. And MALDEF, from its very beginning, 53 years ago, has granted every year law school scholarships. And that is because when we were founded, one of our first, and indeed our first funder, was the Ford Foundation. And in the 1960s, they recognized a problem in the pipeline of lawyers who could represent the Latino community in its civil rights concerns. So they asked the founders, gave them more money than they asked for, and asked that they use that extra money to create a law school scholarship program. And I run into scholarship recipients going back decades whenever I go around the country. That's that impact. And the main criterion for these scholarships is a demonstrated commitment to serving the Latino community through the law. And I hasten to add, and proudly add, that unlike other scholarship programs, we do not care about your status. It does not matter what your immigration status is, you are eligible for and you can receive a MALDEF Law School scholarship. And again, related to that, while we don't give scholarships for undergraduates, we do have on our website, maldef.org, a scholarship opportunities guide where we try to identify scholarships and indicate where they are open to anyone regardless of status, because that's so important for so many immigrant and indeed non-immigrant Latinos, that they have access to resources to go on and successfully complete higher education.
That's fantastic. What an invaluable resource. And it's great that you're also helping them find other ones that are available. And I'll also put it out there for our listeners right now. You can ask questions. We'll open up at the end for some Q&A. So if you do have any questions, anything that Thomas is bringing up here, please do drop it in the chat and it'll be relayed to us, and we'll try to make some time for that at the end. You brought up with DACA, with Obama, you mentioned our previous administration that we went through, and everything that we saw there. And now we have Biden, that was part of the Obama administration. So my question is when you see these different administrations come through, is it a noticeable difference between your day-to-day work and now seeing some of the stuff that was initiated, by Obama that had Biden as vice president? Now he's our president. So are you seeing things come back? Are you seeing things go away? What has that been like over the past 16 years?
It's certainly 100% clear to us that we are coming out of the most anti-Latino presidential administration in our history. That is not to say that there have not been anti-Latino administrations in the past, but the Trump administration was open and obvious about his hostility to the Latino community. It started in the very beginning of his presidential campaign in June of 2015, when he descended the escalator and proceeded to engage in a slander of the Mexican immigrant community, accusing them, as you all may recall, of being criminals. And he used even harsher words than that, and then built his campaign around hostility toward Latino immigrants, particularly. Of course, he had blatant hostility toward many other communities, other immigrant communities, the Black community, the Muslim community. But he began his campaign and pursued throughout his administration a series of steps and rhetoric that really demonized and targeted Latino immigrants in particular. So I don't make any bones about this being clearly the most anti-Latino presidential administration in our history. So yes, the Biden administration is in many respects a breath of fresh air. That is not to say there are not flaws in what the Obama administration did or failed to do with respect to immigration. Does not mean that there are not steps that I believe the Biden administration should take more urgently than it has taken so far. But it is dramatic change not to have the daily rhetoric demeaning, diminishing, demonizing the Latino community, which is what we faced under Donald Trump. And I want to make sure we don't ever forget that because the danger is it comes back. As you know, he is attempting to come back, and that's a very serious concern to the Latino community. Again, that is not to say that there are not changes that need to be made. Most immediately, it is our hope that we can get to a point that the Congress will do its job and enact legislation that would protect DACA recipients and many millions of others who have, over years and years, contributed to our country's development and its economy and its communities, who have raised families here, but who have been denied the full legal protections of having lawful immigration status. We need to address that. In the pandemic, so many of our essential frontline workers were undocumented immigrants, whether that's in the fields of agriculture or service industries where folks were required to work, not from home, but out at their job sites throughout the pandemic, subjecting themselves to great risk of infection. But now is the time to recognize that additional sacrifice on top of the decades of commitment demonstrated by these folks through legislation that would protect them. We know that supermajorities of our population support providing legal protections, for example, to DACA recipients and other immigrant youth who have been raised in this country. And yet, because of a split in the Senate, the continued use of the filibuster, and a lack of leadership, I have to say, particularly in the Republican Party on this issue, we cannot get legislation through that would do what supermajorities of public want to be done. And when I last checked, that's actually anti-democratic. In a democracy, when supermajorities of people want something positive to happen for the country, it should happen. But it's not happening now, and it hasn't happened in the past because of small p politics, small-minded politics, I think, that has refused to grant these millions of folks the protections that they have more than earned through what they have done for this country, including through the pandemic.
Can you talk about, I'd love to hear, you've worked with so many people on a grassroots level, and this MALDEF has been operating for 53 years. You've been there for some time. Are there specific instances that have impacted you, that you know you made a difference? You're like, I'm going to keep doing this. And you've talked about recipients that have reached out. There's cases that you may have worked on. Are there some that stand out for you that you are open to sharing about with us?
I think I have to start by saying every client that we represent is inspiring, if only in their courage to step forward. And I think this is what people always don't understand, often don't understand, and that is that it takes courage to be the plaintiff in a civil rights lawsuit. Whether you're challenging your employer, you're challenging your school, you're challenging your government, it takes courage to put your name or even your face on a case that challenges the conduct of those empowered groups of people. And so I'm always inspired by the courage shown, whether it's that young man who came forward to challenge Abercrombie and Fitch, where he had worked for quite some time, or a mother who comes forward on behalf of her child, another recent case of ours, to challenge a school district that had threatened her, the mother, with being reported to ICE simply because she was advocating on behalf of her daughter, or the parent of another young woman, another recent case, who stepped forward on behalf of her daughter because her daughter in her school faced being berated publicly in front of a classroom by a teacher who was simply reacting to the child wearing a Mexico soccer jersey. So there's courage also shown by folks who are facing dire consequences, health consequences, violence potential. So I think that every civil rights plaintiff that we represented that has appeared in any case shows tremendous courage. And I tell every client we talk to, They're the ones who are on the front line. What we do is important, but it's not nearly as risky as what plaintiffs do. That's not meant to discourage people. We need folks who step forward with that courage and resilience to challenge unlawful discriminatory acts. We won't change our country if we don't get more and more heroes stepping forward like that. So my heroes are our clients, as well as the staff who work for MALDEF and make daily sacrifices, financial sacrifices, other sacrifices, to pursue this important work. I know that these heroes are going to change our future. And that's what makes me optimistic about the Latino future and the future of the United States.
Wow. Well, thank you, Thomas. This has been an absolutely fantastic conversation. Can you tell us how our folks out there can connect with MALDEF's endeavors? Is it on LinkedIn? Is there a social media page? Can they donate? Where do they go? What should they do next?
Thank you. I invite you all to see our website, maldef.org, maldef.org. We have lots of information about our current activity, as well as some blogs talking about some of our historically most important cases. You can also choose to donate there. Also invite you to follow us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, where we are today. We look to expand that in the future, but we do post about the important civil rights work that we see happening and that we're engaging in, including all the lawsuits that we're filing. I will simply end by saying we're filing a lawsuit today against the state of Texas on that redistricting issue that I mentioned previously. The state legislature has managed to draw lines that fail to recognize that half the growth of the state of Texas over the last decade, growth that resulted in 2 additional congressional seats for the state of Texas, but the legislature has failed to recognize that half the growth of that state is in the Latino community and is engaged in unlawful actions in its redistricting.
Well, we'll be following you there on all the social medias. You can go to the website at maldef.org. I believe we'll drop that all in the chat for you. And thank you again, Thomas, so much for making the time today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Thank you both. Thomas, I'm like taking notes as well as you speak. And I hope that people are listening and being as inspired, or at least a drop of the inspiration that you feel based on these heroes that are coming to you and courageously sharing their story. So thank you so much and good luck with what's going on in Texas. We're sending you all of the positive vibes so that you can win that case.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right.